last chapter. Last chapter we had them in terms of x, y, and r. This chapter we have them in terms of opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. So back in the day, you might remember the saying soh-cah-toa. Have you guys heard that before?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think you did it in geometry, but let's be honest, that was a few years ago. So let's just remind myself that means I still say that to this day because who really has this stuff memorized? So to remember the trig functions, this is to kind of remember those first three. So when we say so, that's sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent. So basically it's to remember those three trig functions and their ratios in terms of opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. For the other three, one, you guys can kind of always refer to your notes, or just have your notes in order. But it is good to start to remembering which ones are the reciprocals. So if you can remember that sine and cosecant are reciprocals, once you know sine, you can just flip it to get cosecant. Same thing with cosine and secant, you would just flip that. And same thing with tangent and cotangent. So once again, I don't have these necessarily memorized. I just think of these three and then I flip them. So just little things to kind of know. So one other thing that we very much need is we need to make sure we're okay with labeling a triangle. So I'm going to draw a right triangle. So for all the triangles in this chapter, and to use all this fun stuff, it needs to have a 90-degree angle. We're usually going to label it ABC just out of habit. So I'm going to call this angle A. I'm going to call this angle B. And I'm going to call this angle C. Usually we always make angle C the right angle. So I'm just going to kind of make little notes to myself. This might be good, especially when you're trying to do stuff at the end of the week. If there is an uppercase letter, that's an angle. Okay. So we just wrote those with uppercase letters, so it's an angle. If there's a lowercase letter, that's going to be a side. And to figure out a side, I'm just going to make a little note to myself. It's opposite the angle. So that means a bunch of nothing right now, but I'll kind of show you what that means. I don't know why. And I was talking to a geometry teacher about this. In geometry, you would label this as side AB. We don't do that in trig. I don't know why. It's just against what we believe in. But to label our sides, if you go to angle A, which is uppercase, go to the side opposite. This is side A. You can see that's with a lowercase letter, so that's why it's a side. If this is angle B, the side opposite is side B. And if this is angle C, the opposite is side C. C's are kind of annoying because uppercase and lowercase look the same, but do your best. And when we're talking about opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse, it depends on what angle, so we'll talk about that in a second. But the hypotenuse is always the same. The hypotenuse is always opposite the 90-degree angle. So that side is your hypotenuse. So I'll just make a note to myself, hypotenuse is opposite the right angle. So just little things, the adjacent and opposite we'll talk about in a second with an actual example. But just in general, that's how we label a triangle in trig. Sometimes in geometry it's a little different the way you label the sides. So I wanted to point that out to you before we kind of got started with some numbers. I'm going to leave that for a second because I do have to erase to do the next thing. I know it's hard for you guys, and I do feel bad because we kind of load everything in Monday, Tuesday, and then you're working on it. And I'm sure it's easy to forget this stuff because you're probably not going out and measuring triangles in your real life. But the better notes that you take now, the easier your life will be at the end of the week. And then just in general, the easier it will be as we move forward. So try to take as good a notes as possible. I know it's pre-8 a.m., but we're going to do our best. Does anyone have any questions with labeling a triangle? Okay, so let's actually look at a triangle because this is meaning a bunch of nothing right now. So I'm actually gonna erase this, and I'm going to make a triangle but put some numbers in. All right, so what do we get? I'm like the worst artist as well. Okay, so we're still gonna label this ABC. I'm gonna say C is the right angle, and I'm gonna say this is the side 3, and this is the side 4, and I want to find sine of A. So it looks a little different because before we would just say sine theta, and we kind of just go. Now it's specifying that it's sine of angle A, so that's why this is a little bit different. So what I always do, 99% of this class is just about labeling. Go back and remind myself, what do I need? I need opposite over hypotenuse, so I'm just going to remind myself of that. So as I'm looking at this, make sure you actually go to angle A. So when I'm thinking about opposite or adjacent, opposite is the opposite side, that kind of makes sense. Adjacent is the one kind of connected to it. And then we know hypotenuse is over here, so if you always want to label that, that might help you out. So from angle A, opposite is 3. Okay, so that's just kind of labeling and knowing what to look for. The hypotenuse I don't necessarily know off the top of my head. You might be able to figure it out if you can kind of remember. But it all goes back to Pythagorean theorem. Last chapter we did it with x, y, r. You can do it with ABC, this section. But it's just all Pythagorean theorem and being able to find the missing side. So this would be 3 squared plus 4 squared equals c squared. That gives me 25. Or if you can remember a 3, 4, 5 triangle. This side is 5. So my hypotenuse is 5. So if I asked what's sine of A, you would just say 3/5. So 99% about labeling. Once you kind of have everything in order, you just figure out what numbers go where. So using that same triangle, let me just show you some of the different problems I could ask. I could ask I don't want to ask that, sorry. What's tangent of B? So there's a difference because in this case, I was using this as kind of my reference, but I'm switching to this angle. So you just have to always pay attention what angle you're kind of referring to. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. Okay. So just remember, now we're doing opposite from here. So you just kind of have to flip your angle. So from B, the opposite, you go to the opposite side is 4. And the adjacent, that's the hypotenuse, so we don't need that. The adjacent is the one connected to it, so that would be 3. So it's really just kind of getting used to, okay, what angle am I talking about? Like, how do I have to look for stuff? But hopefully the actual, like finding the side shouldn't be too terrible because that's Pythagorean theorem. So it's just getting used to that new, depending on what angle we're doing, it kind of switches your opposite and adjacent. So let's try one more with this one. Let's say I wanted to find the secant of A. I would say, okay, label. Secant is hypotenuse over adjacent. This is of A, so we kind of go back to here. And we say, from angle A, what's the hypotenuse? The hypotenuse is always 5, no matter what angle I'm talking about. But I need the adjacent. So remember we said this was opposite. So this is adjacent, would be 4. And then that would be my final. Just take a second, if nothing else, you write it down and you say, okay. Obviously that's our first problem. We're gonna practice more, but at least I have a good example or two. Does anyone have a question with that? Let's try one more. I'm going to do one where one of the sides isn't necessarily like a nice integer, so we'll maybe have a radical or a square root. And then I'll give you one to try. And then we'll take a little break and then I kind of just wrap up. All right, so let's look at another right triangle. So remember, you have to have a right angle to be able to use this. I'm gonna flip it around. So I feel like I always draw triangles the same. You don't have to draw them like that. I'll draw a triangle like this. Why not? So they kind of can be flipped around. They can be in any sort of direction here. So we're gonna say this is angle C. We'll say this is A, this is B. So you just have to kind of pay attention to how it's labeled. I'm gonna say this side is 2 and this side is 7. And I wanna find cosine of A. I wanna find tangent of B. And I wanna find cosecant of A. Once again, we're kind of practicing with a few. Sometimes I'll just have you try one, but just to get used to it. Okay, so I personally like to just have all my sides labeled. So I go back and do the Pythagorean theorem, and I find my missing side. So I'm just gonna make sure we're okay with labeling. If this is angle A, I go across, and this is side A. So just for labeling purposes, just make sure you're okay. If this is angle B, I go across. This is side B. Sides are lowercase. And as of right now, I don't know what side C is. So I'm gonna need that when I'm doing this, so I might as well just find it kind of to start. So I'm gonna go back to Pythagorean theorem. We've been doing this for a while now, I just kind of changed my letters up. But I'm gonna do 7 squared plus 2 squared. That's 49 plus 4, which is 53. I don't think I can do anything to that, but I always like to check. Yeah, 53, I'm not gonna do anything. So C squared comes out to 53. And I'm gonna take the square root. I can't break that down, so if you could, you would have done a factor tree, but kind of, that's just what we're stuck with. So I'm gonna go back and just label this as the square root of 53. Okay, so I like to do that first personally. I feel like it always pops up that you're gonna need all the sides, so you might as well get it done with. So now let's start to go back and just remind myself of what we need and what angle we have and all that stuff. So cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So just make sure you're using the right angle. So from angle A, adjacent. Remember, this isn't adjacent, that's the hypotenuse, because that's opposite the thing. So this is automatically the hypotenuse. So adjacent would be 2. And then hypotenuse is square root of 53. And then just as a reminder, we never want square roots in the denominator. So this was on our last little assessment there. So you're going to have to rationalize. And that would be your final answer for cosine of A, because remember cosine of B would be different. Tangent of B. So I remind myself, what's tangent? It's opposite over adjacent. Okay. I'm switching angles though, so just be careful, because I'm using B this time. Opposite, you go to the opposite side is 2. Adjacent, remember I don't care about hypotenuse, adjacent would just be 7. Okay, that one was easy, 2 7s and done. Cosecant is hypotenuse over opposites. So just make sure, from my angle A, hypotenuse is the same no matter what, it's the square root of 53. And then opposite of A is side A, which is 7. Excuse me. So, no matter what, when you start with a right triangle, make sure you have all 3 sides. So if you don't, you use Pythagorean theorem. And then once you have all 3 sides, just make sure you have your trig functions somewhere because you can refer back to them. Just make sure you're using the correct angle, and you should be okay. All right, so let's take a little break. I'm gonna pause this. So if I were to give you this right triangle, would you be able to kind of label it? Could you find all the sides of it? And then if I asked you for a trig function, could you figure out what it was? So once again, these triangles can be kind of drawn all sorts of weird. I can't draw things weird. Okay, that's a right triangle. That's my right angle. Let's see, I'm gonna say this is A, this is B. I'm gonna say this is 5 and this is 6. So as I'm kind of writing these up, right now if I said, hey, can you find this third side, would you be able to do it? So think about, am I finding a side or am I finding the hypotenuse? Think about a squared plus b squared equals c squared, plugging in and finding that unknown. And then I'm going to ask you to find, I'll just do 2. We'll do sine of A and secant of B. So to the best of your ability, kind of trying to follow what we just did. And I feel like one of the things people have said is they want more practice kind of on their own in class to see if you know or if you can follow. Are you on track with how to do that?
Come back in 15 minutes. It's like a way Jackson.
Like I know that.
These.
Yeah, the others are.
It's packed with
Yeah.
that. I need to finish my food. I have like 8 minutes left just sitting there. Mac and cheese.
I'll give you about 30 more seconds to see how far you can get. Hopefully you're noticing the more you're labeling, the easier it is. Okay, so the first thing I would do is I would just make sure I have all my sides. I'm sure it's gonna pop up that I need them all in a second anyways. So just as a reminder, find your right angle. Across from that is your hypotenuse. So I don't know my hypotenuse, which kind of makes sense because I don't know C. So I throw in A and B. A is 6, B is 5. Throw those bad boys in. I just put them, I'll put those right. That's gonna equal 61. And then I take the square root. So C is just gonna be the square root of 61 because I can't break that down. All right, so that's not too terrible. So now sine, I remind myself, is opposite over hypotenuse. For angle A, so I think of angle A, opposite is 6. Hypotenuse is the square root of 61. I'm gonna have to do a little bit of rationalizing. to get that into a little bit of a nicer form, because we don't want radicals in the denominator, so that would be your sine A. And secant B, so once again, I don't know what secant is, okay, so I look over, it's hypotenuse over adjacent. Hypotenuse is square root of 61, so that doesn't change no matter what. But for angle B, adjacent would be 6, right? Because 5 would be opposite, so adjacent would be 6. And that would be my thing. That doesn't make sense. Oh, no, that doesn't make sense because I switched the angles. Never mind. So can you please check those right now? So as you worked by yourself, was there any questions on that one? All right, there's just one more thing I want to show you because I'm pretty sure at the end of the week, your problem will be set up like this. So I'll show you now, then I'll show you again tomorrow. So, I usually label ABC, but I think the way the worksheet is that I'm gonna give you, I'll just kind of label it like this. Theta, and this is 3, and this is 7, and I'm gonna say find cosine theta. Okay. So I just wanted to show you, because there's different ways you can label things, and I'd rather just show you kind of every way you're gonna see. So we notice, hey, this isn't labeled with ABC, and that's okay. Basically, it just says, I'm just dealing with this one angle, so I don't even care about that angle, so I don't even label it. So this is the angle that we're gonna use as kind of our reference for opposite and adjacent. It tells me to find cosine theta. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So check, from theta, adjacent would be right here, which I don't know. Hypotenuse I do know, so remember, if you know where the right angle is, you know the hypotenuse. So my hypotenuse is 7. I just wanted to remind you, from back in the day, / like last week, if you're using Pythagorean theorem and you're finding a missing side, which we're gonna have to do now, if you want to label it ABC, I don't really care. Just make sure C is always your right angle. So you can always go back and label it if you please. Just make sure if you're labeling it, we don't know A, we do know B, we do know C. So as you're plugging into the Pythagorean theorem, just make sure you don't, I feel like sometimes we just always assume we're finding C. In this case, we're finding A. So as you're doing it, you kind of have to solve a little. I'll just subtract 3 squared. I just use my calculator, because why not? Why hurt my brain at 7 a.m.? That gives me 40. I do take the square root, and do remember this one I can break down. And it comes out to 2 square root of 10. So 1, it was a little different, just the way it's labeled. I'll make sure we go over the labeling and how your stuff will look at the end of the week. 2, you were solving for a side rather than for the hypotenuse, so I just wanted to kind of re-go over that. But now from theta, the adjacent is 2 square root of 10. We knew the hypotenuse, so we kind of throw it in. So little things that will pop up. We will do more of that tomorrow, but I wanted to really show it to you as an intro today. So when you come in tomorrow, you're gonna do a warm-up based on this. Please ask questions if you have them. We'll do obviously a little bit more practice and a few other things with kind of soh-cah-toa stuff. You'll be on your merry little way for the week. And